ערב טוב לכולם, שמי כפיר כהן ממכון וליר בירושלים. אנחנו מאוד מאוד מתנצלים על האיחור, לנו קצת בעיות טכניות, אבל הצלחנו, ארג'ון איתנו, ואנחנו נתחיל. הערב הזה, גם דברי הקדמה שלי הקצרים וגם ההרצאה של ארג'ון תהיה באנגלית, אז אני אעבור כרגע לאנגלית. So hi everyone, and thank you all for joining us. My name is Kfir Cohen-Lustig of the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute. We are very sorry for our delay. We had some technical difficulties, but Arjun is with us from Berlin, and we are all good to go. I'll just say that I'm very happy to launch our Global Studies Forum of the Van Leer Institute with a lecture by Professor Arjun Appadurai of New York University. I'll say in a word that the Global Studies Forum that just launched comprises of more than 50 young and established scholars from Israel who will study who already study the contemporary global aspects of our societies in Israel and the world. And this will be the first talk, hopefully, of several that we'll have this year and the next. And I will introduce Professor Appadurai, and then we'll hear his talk. Unfortunately, we won't be able to open the talk for a Q&A given the virtual nature of the conversation, but you can always, of course, keep in touch with us in other means. So Arjun, I will introduce you and then pass it to you. So Professor Arjun Appadurai is currently lives in Berlin. He is the Goddard Professor of Media, Culture, and Communication at New York University and Senior Professor of Anthropology and Globalization at the Hertie School in Berlin. He is author or editor of more than 20 works and also of more than 100 scholarly articles. He is currently a member of the International Advisory Commission on the Futures of Education for UNESCO. He is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. His most recent book with Netta Alexander is called Failure with Polity Press that came out in 2019. Appadurai is also a co-founder and also currently a co-editor of the journal Public Culture. So Arjun, I'm very happy and pleased to turn it over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm sorry for whatever part my laptop or equipment may have played in this delay. And I'm grateful to you and your technical colleagues, as well as to those who are signed up for this event. I'm delighted to be here. I have to say in a more anecdotal vein that I've known about the Van Leer Institute for a long time, and I've known people like Shmuel Eisenstadt and Yehuda Elkana and David Schulman and others who have had different kinds of links, significant ones, I think, to the Institute. So I'm very delighted and honored to be here to help you kickstart this initiative. So because we are behind on time, I'm going to launch right in. My talk has the playful title Globalization 2.0 or 2.0, Rethinking Connectivity in an Age of Lockdown. So basically it's a reflection on globalization studies and from my point of view, where they have come from and what they confront today. Not everything, but some issues, some challenges. So this cryptic title signals my interest in addressing the recent debates about the rebirth of the nation state in the era of pandemic disease and about whether globalization is about to be rolled back or marginalized. My own view is that globalization remains irreversible, but that the markets dominated by globalization are now facing the resurgence of other models of sovereignty, alliance, and identity. So we are entering a new period of volatility in which global norms and strategies are in a deep struggle with the nation state model on the one hand and planetary anxieties on the other. My main argument, which I'll just flag right away, is that we must be careful not to sacrifice, and here I look at our current situation, what I call social health because of our current preoccupations with medical health. So the debates about globalization for me have to do with enduring issues about social health, what I call social health. But then we are in a crisis today of medical health. So by social health, I mean our capacity for conviviality, creativity, and collective solidarity. By medical health, I mean more or less, as we all do, the public concerned with the management and control of disease, mortality, and morbidity. So to understand what is happening to the public debate about medical health, let me first share some thoughts about whether Corona or COVID-19 has put the brakes on globalization and given nation states a fresh lease on life. So this section I call viral globalization. So even in the heady early years of globalization, back in the 1990s, scholars of this new trend were worried about its viral qualities, its speed, its ability to penetrate borders and regulations, its capacity to transform and even colonize the countries to which it came. I was one of those analysts, though most of us thought globalization was likely to be a largely positive force. We did not anticipate then that globalization could gradually become dangerous, infectious, so to speak, and hard to control. Both the populist right and the environmentalist left have used the current pandemic as a lens to criticize globalization, even though some critics of globalization, such as Trump and Bolsonaro, for example, are among the worst equipped to actually tackle the virus. After this early period of enthusiasm of the early 90s came a spate of viruses that themselves seemed to be global travelers: AIDS, the swine flu, mad cow disease, SARS, various brands of influenza, and now COVID-19. This last scourge is the most globalized in our history. Its speed of movement is matched only by the scale of its global reach. And it has unleashed a debate about globalization, which many opinion makers have taken the view that globalization is in trouble. All of a sudden, the world seems ready to hit the pause button on globalization. This is the view of many opinion makers in the media, in academia, and in politics. Indeed, I hear this in Germany, perhaps you hear this in Israel. Many voices have halted the virus, have hailed, the virus as the medicine, the virus as the medicine that will cure the damaged planet, restrain the cruelties of globalized capitalism, and restore the virtues of communities and countries over those of corporations and markets. The widespread push to close national borders and to keep foreigners, tourists, and migrants out taps into prior sentiments of xenophobia and racism in many countries. Is this push the thin edge of the wedge in a growing effort to turn the clock back on globalization? Perhaps, but in my view, such an effort is wishful thinking. Globalization is here to stay. It's a horse that left the barn 30 years ago, when the Soviet Union fell, when free markets for labor and capital became the norm, and when financial markets became more important than the trade in goods and services. These trends cannot be reversed any more than the Industrial Revolution or the emergence of computers. But COVID-19 has led to debates that are unlikely to be resolved easily or quickly. Even in small, homogeneous, and tightly run states like South Korea, Switzerland, and Japan, there is no consensus on school closings, economic slowdown, or the limits on surveillance. In large multicultural nation states, both democratic and authoritarian, ranging from Canada to Indonesia and Mexico to South Africa, the balance between medical, legal, and economic opinions is hard for most leaders to strike. Still, it's clear that no significant global player is moving away from its broad global strategies. China quietly continues its enormous investments in the Belt and Road Initiative, while the US and Russia are in an ongoing tussle about major arms deals with India, intensified since the COVID-19 crisis became global, since neither power wants to shrink its global share of the arms market. French President Emmanuel Macron and President Donald Trump recently came to a broad agreement to slow down the EU effort to tax the big American tech firms, Google, Facebook, Microsoft, in the interest of avoiding a tariff war between the two countries, that is US and France. Germany, where I live now, remains keen to avoid lining up with either the US or China in the most recent hostilities between the two. Though many nation states are largely preoccupied with tightening their borders, maximizing their medical resources, and prioritizing the health of their citizens above all else, no country has taken any serious action to undo or reverse their global alliances, interests, and strategies. Once defined as the only way for modern societies to find a general framework for sovereignty, territory, loyalty, and legal power, the nation state no longer monopolizes many of these features, as migrants, both legal and illegal, become key parts of the global economy. National legal frameworks are increasingly challenged by the global flows of finance, the reach of human rights claims across national boundaries, and even populist xenophobia thrives on cross-border models and alliances. Trump and Netanyahu, Modi and Bolsonaro, Erdogan and Assad, Orban and Putin. The list is long of such pairings and mutual learnings. Now the nation state seemed to be having a rebirth after many decades of being seen as a junior partner to markets, corporations, multilateral agencies, and media organizations. COVID-19 appears to have given, as I say, the nation state a fresh lease on life. Many presidents and prime ministers have been given enhanced powers. The populations they lead have generally increased their faith in them also. This has led some to fear that the authoritarian leaders now in power in many countries will become even more dismissive of liberal political values. But the revival of the power of the nation state is limited. This is an important part of my personal view. No state can use the coronavirus to sweep away the reach of the financial system. The economic indicators that underpin many leaders' popularity are based on internationalized labor, raw materials, and supply chains that cannot be drawn back into national nets and boundaries without causing quality of life indicators to tumble. Anybody can, if I may jokingly say it, try to be Pol Pot, but it's not a path to success. On the flip side, citizens have become newly aware of their own power and agency in securing the survival and prosperity of their own nation states by following public health rules and by making economic and social sacrifices. Neither politicians nor citizens are likely to forget this rediscovery of the social power of ordinary people like you and me. So a return to the nation state's golden era won't be happening anytime soon. The recent crisis has also shown how neither science nor technology can succeed without globalization. This was exemplified by the effort of President Trump to help the US about 5 months ago to buy a German company developing a coronavirus vaccine. The attempt, which failed, was a marker of the tensions that arise when the international potential of science collides with national ambitions and anxieties. The best virologists, epidemiologists, and public health experts are in constant touch with one another across national boundaries. Drug companies rely on globally conducted trials and scientific talent drawn from a global pool. Emergency equipment is sent from various countries to one another. Although there's still a competitive race to find the best tests, equipment, vaccines, and cures, the globalized model of corporate collaboration in the big pharma corporate world is sure to continue. And nation states that treat the pandemic as a zero-sum game to be won or lost are sure to fail. But the irreversibility of globalization is not meant, as some predicted in the 1990s, the end of xenophobia or the reduced marginalization of vulnerable groups. Many right-wing populists, like Donald Trump, are responding to the crisis, even today, by mobilizing the racist, anti-migrant, and anti-liberal prejudices of their followers. Others, like President Bolsonaro in Brazil, have openly shown their contempt for the advice of scientists. Yet others, like Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, have used the crisis to stoke Islamophobia and abandon the working and migrant poor that came to India's cities from its villages. The downsides of globalization might well deepen faster than its upsides. Now, COVID-19 is a truly global virus, much as globalization itself retains its viral qualities. The nation states of the world have had highly uneven success so far in their response to COVID-19, and that is primarily because the architecture of the system of nation states is not well suited to an age of problems without national boundaries. Since globalization is here to stay, it is a system of nation states that might be well forced to change in ways that some might welcome and others will resist. That battle, that is, between the nation state and global processes, will outlast the story of COVID-19. In this battle, cities, I think, are likely to be the laboratories, the battlegrounds, and the incubators of a more equitable future. That is a rather separate argument, and it has to do with the widespread agreement that cities are going to have very large, that many people worldwide are going to move to cities. Many of those cities are going to be very big. Many of those big cities are going to be very unequal. And therefore, if there are solutions to the fundamental problems of the world, they are likely to be found in cities. That doesn't mean that cities are guaranteed to produce solutions, but to look for solutions in villages, in the middle of islands, out in space is not realistic. It's going to be big cities. So having given you this general view I have of our current moment, in light of the early 90s, or even you could say 1989, since I'm in Berlin, and that's when the wall came down, when many of us were highly optimistic about globalization, about its potential for economic prosperity, for equality, for justice, for the sharing of liberal and democratic values across boundaries. We had many reasons for optimism, including some already beginning hopes in the utopia of the internet, that information would flow freely, people would learn more, and as a result become better informed and therefore more tolerant. Many of these things have been put to the test. But I want to shift now from this substantive picture to a somewhat more methodological question, which I hope is relevant to your project and to your initiative. And that is the question of comparison. of history, of comparison, and particularly, I say connectivity, because connectivity is a big issue in our digital times, but connectivity has always been an issue. And here I want to speak a bit more spontaneously to say that I've been struggling with this problem for a long time. And here's the essence of the problem. The essence of the problem is something that precedes globalization. It's not a special problem for globalization, but it is an additional problem for studies of globalization. Now I'm talking about us as scholars, not as us as politicians, us as citizens, or us as critics or activists, but academics. The challenge is comparison and connectivity are two different aspects of human history, whether one has a very long view or one has a short view. Comparison typically assumes that some light can be cast on two things by juxtaposing, or perhaps on three things, or even more things. So you can have a list from the World Bank of 500 countries with ratings on human rights. Well, that's a comparison. It's a very long list. But when we in historical, social science, and humanistic studies of globalization talk of comparison, usually we're not talking of comparison of hundreds with numbers. We're talking of cases, examples, and usually that's two, which is an interesting question. Why is it two? Why not three, which is fairly close to two? It's one more set of materials, but you'll note that very few people do three. There are some good reasons. I'll come back to that in a minute. But comparison is an old, tried, and true method for doing any kind of human science. It relies on one thing, though, which is quite important, which is that the two things being compared are not too much flowing into one another. In other words, you've got to set them apart. In order to compare, you have to say, here is this and here is that. If the two are constantly exchanging qualities, items with each other, it's very tough to compare them, because it's like comparing your arm with your chest, because there's a direct connection, or any other body part. There's too much connectivity. You've got to have separation. So I'll give you a more technical example. If you want to study real estate prices and compare them in Tokyo and New York, you have to ignore all the ways in which money from Japan is invested in New York, and Goldman Sachs has office in Japan. All that has to be taken out of the picture, and then you can compare. But what are you then comparing? Two numbers, what do they mean? Because the numbers are actually affecting each other. Globalization, from this point of view, raises a big challenge for comparison, because it's all about connectivity. Who is out of the loop? So who can I compare, or what can I compare with something else on the assumption that there's not too much mutual effect, or let's call it contamination, where this case is already contaminating that case, so I can't really compare. Well, globalization, we know by most definitions, means things are moving between locations, people are moving, ideas are moving, ideologies are moving, technologies are moving. So what can you usefully compare? Well, maybe you can pick a very remote place, let's say in the northern end of Greenland, and compare it with a small settlement in Antarctica, and then say, okay, well, the connections are as little as possible, so let's compare. But we know this is not what we really want to do. We want to study things which are not so artificially remote from one another. So what do you do with connectivity? So the methodological question I want to put before you and think about with you for a moment, and it will take us briefly into Asia, into South Asia, where I work, and into the Asian region, just to concretize what I'm saying, so it's not too arid or abstract or abstruse. What can we do about comparison in an era which is deeply defined by connectivity, by flows, to use another language, global flows, global movements, global circulation? do we have to give up comparison? So we try to, as it were, catch the whole thing at once. Well, we know that's very difficult. Who can study the whole world of globalization and eat it in one bite? No way. But then are we going to be like studying this elephant or moving elephant and then saying, I have the toe, you have the trunk, etc., and then somehow add it up? Well, we know that's not very realistic. That may be fine for an encyclopedia where everybody has an entry and then we add it all up. But for analysis of this process, what can we do? And here I want to say that for me, the process of globalization is primarily a process of circulation. It's like blood or something else. The idea for me is circulation, that things move around, and globalization takes its force because as these things move, they crystallize in specific locations in specific ways. And those ways are not the same. So you might say, let's say a song or a slogan or an idea like we the people, moves around. But when it lands somewhere in India or in China or even in the US after starting in France or somewhere else, it connects with something else which is not part of it, which is the location, and creates a new crystalline form, which is, let's say, what the idea of the people means for Mao Zedong, in his day. It did not mean exactly what it meant for Rousseau or meant for Jefferson. So it took on a Chinese meaning. You can't say that Chinese meaning was purely Chinese and created by the Chinese in an isolated manner, but nor can you say it is a simple translation problem. You take the English word or the French word and just find the Chinese word, and the problem is over. It's somehow made real and local. And the philosophical or ontological thing I want to say is globalization is no more than the sum of all those crystallizations. It's not an abstract thing in the sky, which we can look up and study. It's only in these crystallizations that it exists. So its phenomenology is local, but it is more than just a series of localities. So this is a challenging thing. And for comparison, to go back to the question of comparison, my question then is, can we compare when you have a lot of connectivity? And here I want to briefly take up an example which seems very far from our times, the times of digital connectivity, of COVID, of financialization, to take us away from all that to a longer, complex history. Take the case which has always intrigued me, which is the case of the religion or the tradition we call Buddhism. So Buddhism, as probably most of you know, and some of you may know a lot about it, but probably not many because it's a special field, is a religion, a philosophical tradition, a religion, but I say religion because it has to do with transcendental issues, the self, life, salvation, meaning, the cosmos. It's not just about how to live today and tomorrow. Buddhism is an Indian product, but it is an Indian product, that is, it has its birth in the Indian subcontinent, south of the Himalayas, because India as a nation did not exist, of course, when Buddhism was born, but there was a region which was dominated by what we now call Hinduism, and where Gautama Buddha, the founder, was born. Today, it will be very close to a part of Nepal, today's map. Over a millennium or more, the short version of a very complex story is that Buddhism basically got marginalized in India. It was very powerful. It slowly got pushed back by some orthodox Hindu and Brahminical forces. So it basically shrinks in India. Fewer and fewer people are Buddhists. But it's a huge success as an export. It goes along two paths. One path from the south is Sri Lanka, Burma, Thailand, like that, Indonesia. The other path is to the north. It goes to Tibet, it goes to China, it goes to Korea, it goes to Japan. That is a big, big diaspora of a religion, of its ideas, because the number of people who carried it were very few. But the ideas moved. So Buddhism, I always used to say when I used to teach courses about Indian history, is India's greatest export success, but a failure domestically in the long run. After the 10th century, Buddhism is a minority thing in India. It's barely there. Until this past century, when all sorts of marginal groups, particularly Dalits, decided that Buddhism would be the way they get politically organized. So that's a footnote. But over the long span, Buddhism fails in India. So today, can we study Buddhism comparatively? India, Sri Lanka, China, Japan, Burma? And the answer is yes. Why? Because it's tied to very important contemporary issues in politics. Many of you, I hope, have heard the word or the name Rohingya. These are people in Burma who have been subjected to incredible displacement and genocide, but they were people from what today we think of as India and Bengal, Bangladesh, who went and settled in Burma, but in the last 30 or 40 years have been viciously attacked inside Burma as being not properly Burmese. So this is typical issue of our contemporary world. It's the ethnocidal violence against a small minority, which no one even noticed for centuries, but has roots in India, lives in Burma. But these people are now, to tell a terrible, brutal story very briefly, are scattered all over, from Indonesia to Bangladesh to Pakistan to India. Nobody wants to recognize them. Nobody wants to accommodate them. Nobody wants to help them, basically. But the connecting tie is Buddhism. So when you look at the literature, and I won't bore you with the details, what emerges is that there is a way in which Buddhism in Sri Lanka and Burma, not so much in India, because in India it disappeared, but Sri Lanka, Buddhism is super strong, has become very nationalistic, so also in Burma, but so also in other countries. There is a flow, this is connectivity between these countries of xenophobic nationalist messages articulated as Buddhist messages. So this is a strain of connectivity, but because these countries are in other regards very different, we can do something very instructive. And this is the message I want to deliver, that although these are connected countries, we can compare them heuristically. We can't actually compare them as if they're truly disconnected. So what I'm suggesting is that in our times of globalization, where everybody's in contact with everybody else in some way, for something, we can make connectivity a virtue instead of a vice. Instead of saying, oh, how do I do this comparison now? Because everything is connected, we can flip that over and actually begin to do comparisons in a way recognizing that things are moving across and between the boundaries of our units, but only do that heuristically, not pretend that these are truly isolated. So the methodological, so in short, what I'm advocating is that in the time, and I'm going to come quickly back to, as by way of conclusion, to where I began with COVID, with the nation state, with globalization, having taken this methodological detour, I want to conclude this methodological detour by saying we have to recognize that in a world of connection, comparison is based on a fiction. That is a fiction of separation. But we have to do it very carefully. We have to use this as a methodological fiction, not as an empirical fiction. So methodologically, we have to behave as if these are unconnected phenomena that we are comparing. But empirically, we have to be absolutely true to the connections. This is a very hard exercise because we tend to do one or we do the other. So as scholars of globalization, we have to do this. And I come back now by way of conclusion, having made this methodological detour, to say what do we do then in regard to globalization 2.0, by which I can now say what I mean is globalization, when it has faced a situation like COVID, and when many other problems of environment, of migration, all make globalization look like a toxic force, and the nation state look like a protector and a savior, if we are not to succumb to that, I think we need to, as scholars, continue our commitment to studying global processes. Because the great illusion of 19th century social science was that nations were the unit of social science. So 90% of social science, starting from 1850 to 1950, is national. So I'll give you a distinguished example from Germany. If you read the great philosopher Jürgen Habermas on the public sphere, it's a general theory, but every sentence assumes that it's about Germany and Europe. That just simply doesn't need to be said. He's not trying to talk about everywhere and so on. So given that reality, what I'm saying is what we need to do in order not to succumb to the fiction that the nation is the working unit for all our studies, but rather that the global is to take on this fiction of separateness methodologically, but connectivity empirically. So let me stop there and ask you, Kafir, if now I have to go to the other, I'm slightly worried about the other link, but we can try. But I'll stop here anyway.
Arjun, thank you very much. It's been fascinating, both the comments on the contemporary situation and, as we discussed earlier, about how do you start rethinking about global studies today in a relationship to what we did since the 90s. And I think that your argument about the fact that those entities we think are separate are now connected in such a way that comparison becomes complicated. Yeah. I would use perhaps the term abstraction, maybe perhaps in our later conversation, what happens when such abstract relations connect places which were unconnected before, then what do you, basically we ask, what do we seek to explain? What do we want to understand through this new situation? So what kind of concepts and categories allow us then to understand these situations, which we need new concepts for? And that's what we're trying to do, thinking, okay, we did a lot of comparisons since the 90s, talking about global circulation, but if things are more complex and more thick, if these global relations are more thick now, then how do you do it in 2020? So Arjun, thank you very much for this talk. I would like to tell our audience that we will have another public talk in December with Saskia Sasson, who will help us continue thinking about these questions. We will end things here. This conversation will be available, Arjun's talk will be available on our website and on Facebook. You can always watch it again and send us questions if you would like to continue thinking about it. Arjun, thank you very much, and I'll see you in the other room as we go for it now with your other lecture.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye, everybody.